As we begin today, I'd like to remind us again of the exhortation of the Apostle John in 1 John chapter 2, verses 5b through 6. He wrote, "By this we may be sure that we are in him. Whoever says, 'I abide in him,' ought to walk just as he walked." John has insisted that whoever claims to abide in Jesus ought to walk just as he walked. The Greek word translated abide in the New Revised Standard Version is meno. It's the same word Jesus used in John chapter 15, verses 4 to 6, when he said the following to his disciples: "Abide in me as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me you can do nothing. Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned." In the language of the Apostle John, to abide in Jesus is to be grafted into him. Today we would call this being a Christian, or in some traditions, being born again. For the Apostle John in 1 John, any who claim to be followers of Jesus, who claim to be Christians, ought to walk just as Jesus walked. The word the New Revised Standard Version has translated ought bears some consideration as well. In the original Greek, the word is ophelo, and it generally means to owe, or to have to pay. At its core, ophelo has to do with repaying debts. Ought is a fine translation, but the translation leaves it unclear as to whether John has implied that those who claim to abide in Jesus should walk as Jesus walked, or must walk as Jesus walked. By using the term ophelo, the Apostle John has introduced the language of obligation. In other words, for any who would claim to be followers of Jesus, they are responsible, due to the debt they owe to God, to walk as Jesus walked. For John, salvation was given freely, but it's come to us with the ongoing responsibility to walk as Jesus walked. In today's passage from the Gospel of Luke, we're continuing to observe the way in which Jesus walked as a child and young man. In our discussion, this was last time, we observed that Jesus was Torah observant. Today, Luke has revealed more to us about the footsteps of young Jesus. The following reading comes from Luke chapter 2, verses 41 through 52. It says this: "Now every year his parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up as usual for the festival. When the festival was ended and they started to return, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents did not know it. Assuming that he was in the group of travelers, they went a day's journey. Then they started to look for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, 'Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety.' He said to them, 'Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?' But they did not understand what he said to them. Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth, and was obedient to them. His mother treasured all these things in her heart, and Jesus increased in wisdom and in years and in divine and human favor." This passage begins with the revelation that Jesus' mother and adoptive father participated in the festival of Passover every year. So again, Luke has reminded us that the pattern of Jesus' young life was informed by faithfulness to the covenant of Sinai. However, until the year prescribed in this passage, Jesus would have been a mostly passive participant in the festival, because he would have been a child. It was at the age of 12 that Jesus would have had his first opportunity to participate in the adult culture of Judaism. How would Jesus respond to this deepened access to Jewish culture? Jesus went immediately to the temple and began to engage with those who taught the scriptures. In that context, Luke tells us, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. and all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. Upon his first opportunity to engage with teachers of the Scriptures as an adult member of the community, Jesus spent all his time engaging with them. The festival of Passover would have been 1 day long and would have been followed by the festival of unleavened bread. Together these festivals would have required Jesus' family to remain in Jerusalem for 8 days. Luke tells us that Jesus remained in the city for at least 3 additional days after the festivals had ended. During that time, Jesus was listening, asking, and responding. In other words, Jesus had enrolled himself in a type of schooling, the goal of which would have been to pursue the knowledge of God through the Hebrew Bible, our Old Testament. And the process described in Luke is quite rabbinic. We notice that Jesus was not taking tests in which his professors were providing the questions with Jesus expected to provide the answers. As Dr. Marvin Wilson has explained in his book Our Father Abraham, Jewish Roots of the Christian Faith, in Hebrew education, one of the roles of the teacher was to bring understanding as well as knowledge to his students. He taught them to think by evaluating arguments and sorting out the questions. In this connection, we would do well to ponder Abraham Joshua Heschel's thought-provoking words regarding modern education. He wrote, "We evaluate the student by his ability to answer questions rather than to understand problems. Cribs and ponies become a major source of edification." He concludes by calling for a reverse of the traditional Socratic method. He says the truth, however, is that the valid test of a student is his ability to ask the right questions. I would suggest that we evolve a new type of examination paper, one in which the answers are given, the questions to be supplied by the students. It's the end of the quotation. Upon being received as a member of the adult community, Jesus enrolled himself in rabbinic school. He went to where the teachers were, he listened to them, he asked questions of them, and the New Revised Standard Version tells us that he answered them. However, answers could prove a misleading translation. In today's English usage, answer usually implies that a question has been asked that requires a particular response, and the student has then provided the correct response. An answer in that case is the correct response. However, it's unlikely that Luke has explained that sort of an environment. It's more likely that Jesus was engaged in a more rabbinic style of education, in which the teacher was engaged in deep discussions of the Hebrew Bible, probably more than one teacher, and students and other participants in response listened to that conversation, asked questions, and responded to the conversations of the teachers. What impressed those who were there was not that Jesus arrived at correct solutions to questions posed to him. Instead, they were impressed with the depth and insight of Jesus' interactions with the teachers. What Luke has told us is that the depth of Jesus' understanding, along with his ability to grasp the teacher's conversation and engage with them on an equal level, was surprising for a 12-year-old. Since Luke has already told us that Jesus was conceived by the Holy Spirit and that angels had proclaimed his birth and prophesied that he would be Israel's long-awaited Messiah, perhaps this is not so surprising to us as readers of Luke's Gospel. Even so, we should not pass over this early account of Jesus' life too quickly, for it tells us a great deal about Jesus' interests, his values, and the direction of his young life. If we are responsible to walk as Jesus walked, then these are subjects of interest to any who would claim to abide in him. Some years ago, the theologian A.W. Tozer wrote the following in his book, The Pursuit of God. He wrote, "Behind the veil is God, that God after whom the world, with strange inconsistency, has felt if haply they might find him. He has discovered himself to some extent in nature, but more perfectly in the Incarnation. Now he waits to show himself in ravishing fullness to the humble of soul and the pure in heart. The world is perishing for lack of the knowledge of God, and the church is famishing for want of his presence. The instant cure of most of our religious ills would be to enter the presence in spiritual experience, to become suddenly aware that we are in God and that God is in us. This would lift us out of our pitiful narrowness and cause our hearts to be enlarged. This would burn away the impurities from our lives as the bugs and fungi were burned away by the fire that dwelt in the bush." It's the end of the quotation. I think Tozer's right, that the world was then and is still now perishing for the lack of knowledge of God. I also agree that a great deal of our religious ills would be remedied by entering into God's presence. But how are we to do that? Many options have been presented to us in contemporary religion and Christianity, most of them with deeply pagan roots. Drugs, alcohol, and sexuality have all been presented as avenues into encounters with the divine, even by some Christian teachers. Music, too, has been presented as a means by which one might enter into the presence of God. Charismatic experiences, from preaching to speaking in tongues to holy bouts of laughter or running or loss of consciousness, have all been presented to us both as means by which one might enter into God's presence and as evidences that one has entered into God's presence. And yet we recall that the Apostle John has told us that all who claim to abide in Jesus are responsible to walk as Jesus walked. Though this fact is still unclear to this point in the Gospel of Luke will reveal to us that Jesus was and is God in the flesh. So a question we might ask is this: where is God likely to be if we are to seek to encounter him? And a related question is this: where was Jesus likely to be found when God tabernacled amongst us in his flesh? Did Jesus engage with those who were experiencing drug or alcohol-induced hallucinations? Did Jesus spend his time on earth in contexts in which people were indulging their sexual desires? He would have had opportunity, given the plethora of Roman temples present in the Middle East at that time. Did Jesus go to those who were singing or performing for God? Did Jesus like to engage with people at concerts? Were the individuals in crowds who encountered Jesus empowered to speak in other languages or overcome by bouts of laughter or running or loss of consciousness? If one were to encounter God while he walked amongst us in the person of Jesus, where would one have to go? Jesus spent his time in the midst of the people of Israel. Jesus organized his schedule around the requirements of the covenant of Sinai. Jesus spent his time with those who were pursuing the knowledge of God by study and discussion of the Scriptures. We will also discover in Luke that Jesus took time for prayer and gave a great deal of attention to teaching those who followed him. Now it's true that in the course of following this way of life, Jesus' path intersected with the paths of many from many walks of life. For instance, in the course of traveling from Jerusalem back to Galilee after one of the pilgrimage festivals required by the covenant of Sinai, Jesus encountered a woman from Samaria at a well. On another occasion, Jewish leaders brought a woman accused of adultery to Jesus as a test of his loyalty to the Sinai covenant. Even more, many people pursued Jesus for healing of various illnesses and diseases, which he provided. But where were such folks to find Jesus? They would find him obeying the covenant of Sinai, discussing the Scriptures, teaching his disciples, and isolating himself for times of prayer. People pursued Jesus for many reasons, but all could only find him in these places. What does this tell us about God, and what might this mean for those of us who have committed ourselves to walking with Jesus? In the flesh of Jesus, God was to be found by those who were following his teachings and engaging with the records of his speaking, that is, the Scriptures. If we wish to encounter God today, where might we find him? It seems to me that we are most likely to encounter God in the same places and spaces that those who lived with Jesus encountered him. Like them, we might come to God from many walks of life and for many diverse reasons. The point I'm making is not that Jesus only studied, taught, discussed the Scriptures, and participated in the forms of worship God had revealed to Israel. What I am insisting is that the study of the Scriptures, the discussion of the Scriptures, and the forms of worship, ethics, and ways of living that God had revealed to Israel defined Jesus' way of life. This is how and where Jesus walked. And that general course of life brought Jesus into contact with many diverse people. Now, how Jesus responded to such people is, of course, also very important for us who wish to follow him, and those responses are extremely important to the gospel writers as well. But I'm asking us today to pay attention to where Jesus might be found, and therefore where God himself might prove to be most accessible to us. Leading up to Passover, Jesus would be found on the road between Galilee and Jerusalem. While in Jerusalem, Jesus would be found in the temple, among those interested in studying and discussing the Scriptures. While in Galilee, Jesus would be found teaching his disciples and discussing the Scriptures with them. During seasons of festivals and worship, Jesus would be found in the midst of those worshiping God, as prescribed by the covenant of Sinai. In short, Jesus was always to be found in the midst of those who were obeying God, pursuing knowledge of God through study of the Scriptures, and discussing God and his Word. While God walked amongst us in the flesh of Jesus, this is where he was to be found. And so when Jesus' mother and adoptive father went on a furious search to find him, where was he to be found? In Jesus' own words, he said to them, "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" And then afterwards, when he accompanied his mother and adoptive father home, Lucas told us, "Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth, and was obedient to them. His mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in years, and in divine and human favor." Again, Jesus continued on the same road he had been walking. He went with his parents, and was obedient to them. This was also required by the covenant of Sinai, as God had stated to Israel in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 16, "Honor your father and your mother, as the Lord your God commanded you, so that your days may be long and that it may go well with you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you." God became flesh in the person of Jesus, to reveal himself to us, to show us what it means truly to be beings made in God's image, to rescue humanity from our slavery to sin and death, to rescue Israel from the curse of the covenant of Sinai that had fallen on them due to the recurrent generational breaking of that covenant that had preceded them, and to show us how to seek God and where to find him. To ask, where was Jesus likely to be found, and what was Jesus likely to be doing, is to ask, where is God likely to be found, and what is God likely to be doing? May those who have ears to hear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Amen.